Welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today we're going to be talking about the story of the Moravian Church in Alaska. Now, if you're anything like me, you have to ask the question, or I had to ask the question, who are the Moravians? Okay, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Illinois, and I had never heard of the Moravians, even though they have a base not too far from Illinois. But yet, my ignorance was revealed the more I study and learn, and I had to ask, who are the Moravians? So guys, I've done kind of I don't know if I want to call it a deep dive, but I've taken a dive into the history of the Moravian Church and its history in Alaska. And I have about 4 pages of notes here I'm going to go through because I've been doing some research because the Moravians have a good reputation in Alaska. And I wanted to cover their history mainly because I've heard so much about them. And frankly, I knew very little about them until now. And if you're listening to this, I hope if you were in my boat, that you will no longer be as ignorant as I was. So let's talk about the Moravian Church in Alaska because we want to get to know our state one denomination at a time. Here we go. So, who are the Moravians? Well, to answer that question, I went all the way back to their origin story. And they have a really good summary of this on their the Moravian Church's website, which made this really easy to get this story. So, we're going to go through it. Here we go. We have to go all the way back to the mid-9th century. 9th century. So, this goes way back. This was the pre-Reformation, you can call it, sort of the pre-Protestant movement, which is normally considered to be started by Martin Luther in 1517. But yet the Moravian are considered Protestants, and their movement started 600 years before Martin Luther. So really good history here, and the Moravians had a lot of similar ideas prior to Luther, which is fascinating. Now, in ancient Bohemia and Moravia, which is present-day Czech Republic, these countries converted to Christianity through the influence of 2 prominent Greek Orthodox missionaries. Their names were Cyril and Methodius. I hope I'm pronouncing them right, Methodius. They translated the Bible into the common language, and they introduced a national church ritual. In the centuries that followed, Bohemia and Moravia gradually fell under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Rome, so the Catholic Church. But some of the Czech people protested this ecclesiastical jurisdiction, kind of overtaking the country. This is actually incredible because what we call the Reformation was largely marked by, the translation of the Bible to common language. Like Luther translated the Bible into German. That translation is still around, kind of interesting. I don't speak German, but if you did, could be interesting to see how he translated it. But still, the Reformation is marked by getting the Bible into the hands of common folk. But Luther was not the first to do it. This can go all the way back to Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century in what is today the Czech Republic, Bohemia and Moravia at the time. So it is pretty fascinating that to explain Alaska's history, we have to go all the way back to a small group of people living in ancient Bohemia and Moravia. And history is much like looking back to the ripple effects of very courageous people like these guys. And they died not knowing how far the ripples would go. And now here I am in 2025 talking about them like how many years? 1,000? Over 1,000 years later. Little do we know the ripple effects of our lives. Okay, there's another of these courageous people. It was a man named John Huss. He lived from 1369. He died in 1415. Huss was a professor of philosophy at the University of Prague. He preached regularly at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, and this became the origin place of the Moravian movement. So a lot of the origin story of the Moravian movement, it kind of goes into the 9th century with those 2 guys, but then it takes a more prominent role with John Huss. And Huss began to preach against many of the practices of the Roman Catholic clergy and hierarchy, and he gained support from his students at his college and from common people in the area. The Catholic Church accused him of heresy. He was put on trial and burned at the stake in July 6th, 1415. I'm reminded of John chapter 12, verse 24. Jesus says, "Truly, truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls onto the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life." So it may be that our own death will bear incredible fruit, as it did for the life of John Huss in 1415, because his death has led to the gospel being proclaimed all the way over here in Alaska. And of course, John Huss could not have known that his own death would have been gospel proclamation on the other side of the planet. But so it was, because he was willing to lay his life down. So good testimony from John Huss. So John Huss dies in 1415. Then in 1457, the followers of Huss, or at least the followers of his ideas, formed a group called the Unitas Fratrum, or the Unity of Brethren. They had a gathering in the village of Kunwald, which is in the Czech Republic. And the first Moravians were described as, quote, people who had decided once and for all to be guided only by the gospel and example of our Lord Jesus Christ and his holy apostles in gentleness, humility, patience, and love for enemies, unquote. And now this is not on my notes, but it's just a thought that's come to me just now as, the Catholic Church at this time had incredible power and there were incredible abuses. And I'm not knocking the Catholic Church just in general, but in this case, there was that. When there's religious abuse, people crave the genuine gospel, and that's kind of from which the Moravian Church was birthed. Now, it was wildly successful, this movement, even by 1517, which is Martin Luther's famous posting of the 95 Theses, and often the moment in history that's considered the start of the Reformation. But the Unity of Brethren was already numbered at least 200,000 people with over 400 parishes. And they had their own hymnal, their own catechism, and they had 2 printing presses for providing the people of Bohemia and Moravia with the Bible in their own language. So while Martin Luther was, he wasn't intending to start a Reformation, but he did. As he was starting his Reformation, the Moravians already had 200,000 people with 400 parishes at the time. So pretty amazing. Now in 1547, bitter persecution led to the spreading of the church into Poland, where it took hold and it grew very rapidly. It's funny how persecution has a way of spreading the gospel rather than stifling it. That seems to be a historical consistent thing. You persecute the Christians and the gospel spreads. The 30 Years' War, which was between 1618 and 1648, brought farther persecution to the church. And the Protestants of Bohemia were severely defeated at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, and the Moravian movement severely declined because of this war. So war can seem to diminish religious movements, and persecution increases it. Interesting. The prime leader of the church at the time was Bishop John Amos Cormenius. Bishop John Amos Cormenius. He lived from 1592 to 1670. He lived his life in exile as the leader of this diminished movement, but his prayer was that someday the hidden seed of his beloved Unitas Fratrum might one day spring to a new life. His prayer was answered in 1722 when some Moravian families found refuge in the estate of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Man, these names have a mouthful. For my American naive in how to pronounce things, Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, who was a nobleman. Now, his estate became a haven for these religious refugees. Zinzendorf encouraged them to keep the discipline of Unitas Fratrum and gave them the vision to take the gospel to the far corners of the globe. And August 13th of 1727 marked the culmination of a great spiritual renewal for the Moravians. And in 1732, they sent their first missionaries to the West Indies. All right, you can start seeing where this is coming. I will bring Alaska into this. We're getting there. But I just want you to know how they came to Alaska. So I promise we're getting there. We're almost there. Here we go. Now, they began their mission work in America, here we go, in 1735 in Savannah, Georgia. An interesting story is while sailing on a ship during a storm, the experienced crewmen on the ship panicked for their lives, but the Moravians remained calm, not fearing their own deaths. This deeply impacted a young man named John Wesley, who is considered the founder of the Methodist denomination and promoter of Arminian theology. Now, I do not adhere to Arminian theology, but it does still stand that the death of John Huss, which we talked about earlier in 1415, is still bearing fruit, as John Huss's death started a ripple effect which led to the founding of the Methodist denomination by John Wesley. More ripple effects. In 1741, the Moravians purchased 500 acres in Pennsylvania to establish the settlement of Bethlehem. Soon they purchased 5,000 more acres, and the two areas became linked in their agricultural and industrial economy. Other communities in New England also popped up, and these were considered, quote, frontier centers for the spread of the gospel, particularly to Native Americans. They had a particular focus on Native Americans. They also acquired a 100,000-acre tract of land in North Carolina. That's huge, 100,000 acres. And these two larger tracts of land became the North and South provinces for the Moravian Church. Now, these provinces have grown significantly since then, but that's where they came from. They established a number of schools, such as Salem Academy and College, the Moravian College and Seminary, and there are others. Today, more than 1 million people claim to be members of the Moravian Church, most of which live in Eastern Africa. Really fascinating. They had very significant efforts in Eastern Africa with their missionaries. Only about 60,000 of the 1 million are in America, and it is said it's because of their hyper focus on global missions, which has been largely successful. They have sent missionaries to the Caribbean, Greenland, North and South America, and Africa, and also Canada. I know that should be on this list. So I don't know why, but also Canada. They emphasize living among the people where they serve, preaching the love of Christ rather than abstract theology, and a simple heart-centered faith. They seem to focus more on having a simple walk with Jesus rather than having a focus on having a solid theological dogma. So they have this motto. It says their core motto is, quote, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, love. So that is one of the Moravian mottos. Ooh, okay. That is basically the Moravian history at large. Let's talk about how they got to Alaska. Here we go. Deep breath. The United States purchased Alaska in 1867, and it became accessible by Americans rather than the Russians, as we have already seen. The Moravians were established in America with a strong interest to reach their Native American neighbors. Now, this is interesting because this is a shift, because we talked about this in the Russian Orthodox episode, that up until the United States purchased Alaska in 1867, the Russian Orthodox Church were the only game in town. They were successfully reaching the Native Americans with the gospel. And when America bought Alaska, everything was changing. The Protestants were moving in. So Americans at large started bringing in their missionaries. Now, by this time, The Moravians had already sent people to Labrador, which is in northeastern Canada. I had to look that up too because I'm naive on my geography, apparently. I didn't know where Labrador was. I know it's a dog, but I had to type in Google, like, where is Labrador? It is in northeastern Quebec or northeastern Canada. So they sent missionaries there, and they also sent missionaries to Greenland. And if you listen to Nathaniel Jeanson's episode, the interview with him, then you'll know that Alaskans and Greenlanders share genetic ancestry. So a lot of similarities in the cultures there. So now the Moravians, with Alaska opening up, they had set their sights on Alaska, believing that they had already good experience working with Arctic peoples, and they believed that they could get into Alaska. Now in 1884, Reverend William H. Wineland and Henry Hartman were sent by the Moravian Mission Board on a reconnaissance trip to Alaska. They went by ship and they took small boats up the Kuskokwim River, where they surveyed villages. Then they took notes on the populations. They met with Yupik leaders and assessed the food sources, climate, travel routes, and they picked a strategic location for a permanent station at Bethel. They came back with a positive report, which quickly led to the Moravians funding a permanent mission party to be sent immediately. So in 1885, William Wineland, John Kilbuck, their wives, and Hans Torgerson arrived in Bethel and began building the mission house there in Bethel. Hans Torgerson dies in a tragic accident during the construction of the mission house. During the first year, I think he drowned in the river, a real tragedy. In the following years, more Moravians arrived and start missions in other villages in southwestern Alaska. They immediately began a school and providing medical services and started to learn and write the Yupik language. Now, unlike other missions in Alaska's history, which we'll get to, the Moravians valued learning the local languages, the translation of scripture and hymns. They encouraged local leadership and to live among the people rather than above them. It was these ideas that helped the Moravians take root in Western Alaska, which they most definitely did. By 1890, they began to appoint native helpers. Some examples were some men named Hooker, Lomuck, and Kawagaleg. I don't know if I pronounced that right, Kawagaleg. However, the most famous was a Yupik shaman. He was a former Yupik shaman named Uyakak, who became a Moravian pastor. And he ended up taking the name Helperneck. Now, Alaska Geographic, which I think is a newspaper or a magazine, they reported that Helperneck was one of few Native Americans to work out a system for writing his language, developing his own letters to represent sounds. And modern linguists say his writing system may be the only one in the world for which there is a complete record of development. So obviously a very smart, intelligent man, and his efforts led to not only the preservation of his language, but the gospel and scriptures being translated into his language as well. So a real legacy for Helperneck there. In 1891, in response to the disease epidemic devastating the region, the Moravian missionaries called for trained doctors to come and join the mission. And they said, we need someone who can commit to 7 years. There was a young couple named Joseph Herman Romig. I would just say Joseph Herman Romig began training for this, and it was 7 years of medical training. And he started that training. During his training, he met his wife, Ella, and they were married a short time before they left for Alaska. However, while the mission was waiting for the Romigs to arrive, one of the missionaries was caught in adultery with one of the other missionary wives. However, the native people, they liked this missionary so much that they advocated to keep him around. And they almost succeeded until it came out that he had also been having affairs with some of the native ladies. And after that, he got the boot. And so, yes, as it turns out, missionaries can be real scumbags. There's just something about religious hypocrisy that is revolting. And I think all of us kind of know that. But it also should be noted that I got this information not from some obscure source, but it's from the Moravian Church website. Any institution that acknowledges wrongdoing in their own history gives them credibility, because we all know there's no such thing as perfection in human behavior, or especially in human institutions. And in fact, acknowledging it means repenting. It means they're talking about repentance and forgiveness and grace. And this also reflects the gospel. Hiding it reflects some kind of a religiosity that's unhealthy. It's a works-based religion. Hiding realities like that is a very religious thing to do. And the Moravians, way to go on just this happened in our history. Way to go, Moravians. Now, finally, in 1898, the Romig family arrives. And Ella Romig, the wife, begins a journal. And her journals are written down with notably some raw honesty. And her journals have been published in a book called When the Geese Come, which I have a copy of. When the geese arrive, it refers to the hope that arrives when the geese show up, in this case in Bethel, marking the beginning of spring. Ella described, and on the one hand, that she really enjoys living in a less populated area, free from, quote, the painful society and fashion. But on the other hand, she expressed, I am thoroughly disgusted with and tired of my dirty clothes, and I find it such a relief to get out of it for a while. So her journals had a raw honesty to them that you may not read in a missionary newsletter. So it's a good read. I can really relate to living in a remote village. I used to live in a remote village in Mexico. There's definitely a lot of culture shock, just like Ella likely expressed. I did experience a minor amount of culture shock moving to Alaska, but it was a much smaller degree. Because in Mexico, we lived in remote villages with native people. There is sort of that feeling that there's the serenity, there's a slow pace, there's not a lot of people around, and yet there's also a struggle with how different it was. More than anything for me, it was the language barrier that was the hardest. And there was actually 2 language barriers, because their second language, if they spoke a second language, was Spanish, and I had to learn Spanish, and then I had to learn the indigenous language on top of that. And I learned the indigenous language through Spanish. So I learned a third language through a second, and my brain was just tired, and I felt dumb all the time. For me, I think that, and also hardships with other coworkers, where if you study any missionary history, the number one reason why missionaries quit is because of other missionaries. And I have absolutely experienced that before. But regardless, I still have very good friends in Mexico. I still talk to them every month and pray with them. But it was not without hardships. But Ella here, one of the first Moravian missionaries in Bethel, all expressed this in her journals in a pretty raw way. So some good insight. All right, in 1926, the Moravians responded to the dire need for the care of children orphaned by this disease epidemic. They built an orphanage near the village of Kwethluk, and they call the orphanage Nunapitsinguk. I hope I pronounced that right. Nunapitsinguk. This word means great little land. Over the years, this orphanage functioned as an orphanage, but also a boarding school and foster home. Unfortunately, it shut down in 1973. Now, I have been to Kwethluk before, and I remember meeting a woman there who told me that this orphanage saved her life. She herself, she was an orphan in this orphanage growing up, and she herself is fostering many children now. And I flew her and some of these foster children to Keika Retreat Center for an event there. And it's just hard to express how impressive this woman was. And it was clear that some of her foster kids were very troubled. But she was providing likely the most loving home they've ever experienced. And it's because of, it's one of the legacies of this orphanage there in Kwethluk. Now, when I left, the woman told me kind of where the orphanage was because the building was still there. So I took off and I did a low pass over the old orphanage. I think I have a video of it somewhere. I just had my phone video. I'm really glad I did this because the local governing body there burned down the old orphanage building in March of 2025, so not long ago, because of safety concerns. There was vandalism going on, kids sneaking in there and running around the dorms, and the building was kind of falling apart through years of neglect, so they decided to burn the building down. Probably a good choice, but also really sad. I have had this place in the back of my mind for some time, and I think it deserves a story in of itself. But this is a legacy of the Moravian Church in Alaska, is this place. Some reports say that people have bad memories there. There were probably some bad things that happened, but most of the testimonies remember that place with lots of affection, and it was a very good thing. So I haven't looked deep into that, but I would like to learn more about that sometime. All right, that was the orphanage in Kwethluk. Now, by 1929, the Moravians had translated and printed the 4 Gospels and part of the epistles, and they published that in a book, and it was in Yupik. By 1946, the Moravians ordained their first native ministers, Kinnegak and Lloyd Neck. Presumably, this is it could be an ancestor of the original Helper Neck, but I'm not sure. The following year, they opened the training school for native ministers, which later became the Moravian Bible Seminary, and that opened in 1955, and it started out with 10 students. By 1956, the complete New Testament was printed in Yupik. Very impressive. By the 1970s, they had a fully theologically trained theologian named William Nicholson, and he was a native man. And by the end of the decade, the native pastor, Reverend Jacob Nelson, became chairman for the governing board of the Moravian Alaska work. Now, today, there are 22 to 24 Moravian churches across Alaska, depending on how you count. Bethel is considered its headquarters, and the church runs the Alaska Bible Seminary, which still trains clergy and local church leaders. The Alaska province has been governed by a full native provincial board rather than outside leadership. So it's completely been taken over by native leadership, and they emphasize local ministry over global missions as their priority. All right, well, there you have it. There is the story of the Moravian Church. Of course, I left out so much, but trying to be concise just so that we can get a fuller understanding and larger picture of our state in Alaska. So the Moravian Church is far from perfect. I told one bad story, and there are others. But overall, the Moravian Church does have an impressive history here in Alaska and has been a very effective force for the gospel of Jesus. So that's it, guys. Thank you for coming along on this ride to get to know our state, one denomination at a time. We will see you next time.